Assalamu alaikum, welcome back. In our last lecture, we ended on this slide, which was, as I tried to underscore, really a very important quote that our late classical scholars understood the definite role of reason and Matn analysis in authenticating a hadith and in applying a hadith. And so I'm putting the quote up here again at the beginning of this lecture because, as I said, these lectures on the use of reason, Matn analysis, and so forth, I consider really probably the most important, or maybe second most important, lectures of the entire course. And so for this lecture as well, inshallah, we will look a little bit more carefully and with some examples at the importance of using reason and how reason is used in assessing both authenticity and applicability of hadith. So the first use of reason that we want to touch on is in reflecting the hadith against the Quran. As an example, there are various versions of a hadith which indicate that the Prophet stated that someone who is mourned at the time of their death will be punished for the crying of his family over him. This hadith is mentioned in several venues with various transmissions, but is predominantly linked to the stabbing of Umar ibn al-Khattab and his final hours. In one version, according to Anas ibn Malik, Umar forbade his daughter Hafsa to cry over him, saying that the Prophet stated that the one who is cried over will be punished because of that. In another venue, Abdullah ibn Umar, the son of Umar, quotes the Prophet making a similar statement at the funeral of a daughter of Uthman ibn Affan. Now, when Aisha, the Prophet's wife, heard this attribution to the Prophet, she rejected it, asserting that the Prophet did not say this, stating, quote, "Where are you from the words of God? No bearer shall bear the burden of another." Close quote. She was quoting a portion of verse 164 from Surah Al-An'am, and that relevant portion of the verse, وَلَا تَزِرُ وَازِرَةٌ وِزْرَ أُخْرَى, that no bearer of burdens will bear the burdens of another person. What does this mean? It means that each person is just responsible for themselves. So, if it is wrong for someone to cry over a dead person, the dead person is not responsible for that. It's the person doing the crying. The dead person wouldn't bear the burden of that sin if it were a sin. We're not saying it's a sin, and there's clear evidence that it's not a sin. But Aisha rejected the hadith not on the basis of a questionable isnad. She even said that this isnad, that the people you're telling me said this hadith are people who are to be believed, but on the basis that its content contradicted a clear Quranic statement and basic principle of Islamic justice that no one would be punished for the actions of another. So the reflection of hadith against Quranic principles should be a critical part of hadith analysis, and several examples of this will be noted later in this module as well as in the supplementary materials, inshallah. For now, we quote the frustration of Shaykh al-Ghazali regarding the deficiency of this essential part of hadith analysis. He said, and I quote, of course translated from the Arabic, "I have lost patience with people who are weak in their knowledge and understanding of Quran and overly indulged in looking into hadith, thus giving and issuing fatwas which only increase the ummah in its confusion." Close quote. Now, another example before we get into the contents of this particular slide is that there's a hadith reported on no less than the authority of Abu Bakr himself, radiallahu anhu, that at the time of Adhan, Muslims used to kiss their thumbs when the name of the Prophet was mentioned. This hadith, though, is reported by him alone. And since this event took place in the presence of a large number of Muslims, 5 times a day without fail, it should have been reported by a large number of narrators. Since it's reported by only one companion, the hadith is rejected. And this is according to the book Sharia, the Islamic Law, by the scholar Abdul Rahman Doi. Let me give you yet one more example, just to show you that this process of thinking does go on. Very early on in Module 1, if you remember, as one of our examples of hadith, we looked at the hadith that stated that actions are by intentions. إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. Now this hadith, if you remember back to our classification of hadith, we said that the ahad came in different types, and a hadith that has only one chain of narration is considered gharib, estranged. And this particular hadith, even though it is very widely quoted, is actually gharib in its first 4 links in the chain of transmission. After the 4th link, it then is disseminated more widely and you can find different chains. But the first 4 links in the chain, that is it. That's the only way that this hadith comes through. So, it is on the basis of this hadith that most schools of thought think that you should intend an action for it to count. So, for example, I'll tell you my own personal practice. When I go to the sink to do my wudu, I say that I am intending to do wudu. Allahumma inni nawaitu laka al-wudu. I'm not saying you have to do that or that's what Islam says. I'm just trying to make a point. The idea here is that this action of wudu should be done by conscious intent. Yes, the Quran says that we should wash our face, wash our hands, and up to our elbows, and so on and so forth, in the wudu verse in Surah Al-Ma'idah. And the idea is that this should be consciously intended. Now, what am I trying to get at? Well, let's say you go swimming. Of course, your face has gotten wet, your hands have gotten wet, your feet have gotten wet, and you come out. Can you just go ahead and pray because you now have washed everything in the pool and so your wudu is done? Or did you need to intend for this to be your wudu? Most schools of thought say you need to intend for it. The Hanafi school of thought, though, reflects the hadith against the Quran. Does the Quran say you need to intend? No, it just says these parts need to be washed. And they say this hadith is gharib. It only comes through one chain. And therefore, it should not be used to make laws that bind all of the Muslims. So in the Hanafi jurisprudence, if you take a shower and you forgot to say, I make my wudu in the shower, if you fall in a river, however it happens, if you've gotten wet and your parts are washed, that's it, your wudu is done. So again, trying to give you a feel for the reasoning that goes on in, is this hadith applicable, is it not applicable, and so forth. So there would be the use of reason in limiting the scope or applicability of a hadith according to, for example, the Hanafi school of thought. Now, let's look at another use of reason. And this is reflecting the hadith against the acts of its narrator. And this again is in the Hanafi school of thought. So let's dive right in. There's a reported hadith narrated through Aisha, the wife of the Prophet, peace be upon him, to the effect that the Prophet said, quote, the marriage of a woman is invalid without the permission of her guardian. And this hadith is quoted actually without reference in Professor Kamali's book, Principles of Islamic Jurisprudence. And apparently this hadith is reported in the collection of Ibn Majah. Now there's a slightly different wording also attributed to Aisha, that any woman who got married without the permission of her guardian, her marriage will be null and void. And this is again related without reference in Sharia, the Islamic law by Abdurrahman Doi. Now a part of the reasonableness test applied to ahad hadiths by the Hanafi school is that a hadith would be considered invalid if the narrator of the hadith acts contrary to the hadith after having narrated it. So, the Hanafi school does not accept this hadith because Aisha acted contrary to it when she contracted the marriage of her niece, the daughter of Abdurrahman, while he was absent in Syria. So, in the Hanafi fiqh, the permission of a woman's wali, guardian, such as the father or the brother, is not necessary for the validity of a marriage contract. And that may be very interesting to some of you if you've been to marriages and you see that perhaps the person performing the marriage is ascertaining the permission of the guardian. Well, in the Hanafi school of thought, the permission of the guardian, meaning the father, the brother, etc., is not necessary for the marriage to be considered valid. Now, we note that the other major schools of thought do not agree with this criteria as generally used by the Hanafi school, the criteria being that if a narrator acts contrary to the hadith they are narrating, then that hadith is rejected. Most schools of thought don't actually accept that criteria in the general sense, and they certainly disagree with the Hanafi position on this particular topic of the marriage and the permission of the guardian. And our intent here is not to discuss the topic of permission of the guardian because it is a very broad topic. We note in passing that there's controversy regarding the isnad of the hadiths on this topic and that they're not included in the two sahihs and so forth. But our purpose is to illustrate how the Hanafi school brought reason to bear on the judgment or the soundness or the applicability and authority of hadith. And Imam Malik applied a criteria of reason to the acceptance of hadith. So he, for example, preferred the practice of the people of Medina over ahad hadiths as a legal proof, since, quote, he considered the standard practice of the people of Medina to be more representative of the conduct of the Prophet than the isolated report of one or two individuals. End quote from Professor Kamali, page 103, and from Sheikh al-Ghazali's book, page 25. So you see here that Imam Malik was in some sense using some logical criteria, that the people of Medina who had learned directly from the Prophet, peace be upon him, as he lived among them, if they do things one way, and this is what has been taught generation after generation emulating the Prophet, that should be accepted over singular ahad reports. So this point of view, again, represents the application of reason to check ahad hadiths, using the actions of the people of Medina as a, quote, reasonable reflection of the Prophet's practice. And an example of this is the preference of Imam Malik for holding the hands at the sides during prayer rather than clasping the hands with the right over the left, although he quotes a hadith indicating clasping in his Muwatta. So we note that this is obviously a very incomplete view of the Maliki position and justification, which is also based on hadith analysis. Excellent English language references are available on the internet, including articles by Abdullah ibn Hamid Ali and by Suhaib Webb that go into significant detail on this issue. But as the author Ibn Hamid Ali notes in his article, there are much bigger issues facing the American Muslim community than pray with your hands at your sides or with the right hand over the left. But once again, this example is briefly mentioned specifically to illustrate one aspect of the use of reason by Imam Malik. So the main point of all these examples is to once again stress that we need to understand that there's a definite place for reason and logic in our faith, and not to be bullied by those who try to convince us that we need to suspend our reasoning in order to be good, faithful Muslims. We once again, I know we're kind of beating this to death, but we note that this is not simply our modern or westernized opinion, but is a strong opinion of the late classical scholars. So we return to the scholar Suyuti's statement, a very, very famous late classical scholar, quote, "If you encounter a hadith contrary to reason, or to what has been established as correctly reported, or against the accepted principles, then you should know that it is forged." And this is from Suyuti's monumental work, Tadrib al-Rawi, the training of the hadith transmitter, as quoted in Professor Siddiqi's book, page 83. Also, the great scholar Abu Bakr ibn al-Tayyib al-Baqillani, who is a great classical scholar, called by many Shaykh al-Sunnah, is reported to have remarked, quote, "It is a proof of the forged character of a tradition that it would be against reason or common experience, or that it conflicts with the explicit text of the Quran or the mutawatir tradition or the consensus, meaning ijma', or that it contains the report of an important event taking place in the presence of a large number of people when it is related by a single individual, or that it lays down severe punishment for minor faults or promises high rewards for insignificant good deeds," end quote. Quoted again by Professor Siddiqui, and you'll find the reference in your syllabus. So you see that the giants of late classical scholarship were saying outright that if a hadith goes against the dictates of reason, that in and of itself would be sufficient to either reject it or to limit its applicability. So based on statements such as these, Professor Siddiqui, in his book Hadith Literature, Its Origin, Development, and Special Features, compiles a fairly comprehensive list of the late classical requirements for a matn to be judged as sound. Number one, and they're put here on the slide, but we'll just go through them. A tradition must not be contrary to the other traditions which have already been accepted by the authorities on the subject as authentic and reliable. Nor should it contradict the text of the Quran, a mutawatir hadith, the absolute consensus of the community, again, that's the ijma', that Sheikh al-Baqallani was talking about, or the accepted basic principles of Islam. Number two, the tradition should not be against the dictates of reason, the laws of nature, or common experience. Next, traditions establishing a disproportionately high reward for insignificant good deeds or disproportionately severe punishments for ordinary sins should be rejected. And you've probably come across people quoting hadiths that if you read this surah or that surah or say tasbih 33 times, then that's it, the doors of heaven are open. This, in my mind, is an example of disproportionately high reward for insignificant good deeds. I'm not talking about any specific hadith or making a judgment about a particular hadith. I'm saying that you do find these hadiths often being quoted, and just take a beat and you can go back and check the chain and so on and so forth. Now, next, traditions describing the excellent properties of certain sections of the Quran may not be authentic. They may be, they may not be. Traditions mentioning the superior virtue of persons, tribes, and particular places should be generally rejected, and there are many, many such hadiths. Traditions which contain detailed prophecies of future events equipped with dates should be rejected. Traditions containing such remarks of the Prophet as may not be part of his prophetic vocation or such expressions as are clearly unsuitable for him should be rejected. And a matn, the content, should not violate the basic rules of Arabic grammar and style. So these are the criteria that Professor Siddiqui, after having studied the late classical hadith literature, comes away with as what was being used by the late classical hadith masters. And you can see here that the Sunnah itself plays a prominent role, other hadiths play a prominent role, the Quran plays a prominent role, and reason and logic play a prominent role, laws of physics play a prominent role, etc., etc. That people were using their minds to look at the content of the hadith, and that matn analysis was, by the late classical period, a very significant part of hadith authentication and hadith application, and we noted that that is very different than the early classical period when the hadith collections, the canonical hadith collections, were being compiled. And that's why Professor Brown, in a quote we made early on in this 2-lecture series, stated that in the early classical period, you essentially never find the hadith scholars doing matn analysis, doing analysis of content and rejecting a hadith because its content is unreasonable or against established facts and so forth. But by the late classical period, matn analysis had become a very definitive part of our intellectual tradition. Now, clearly, and let's end the lecture here on this point, such an analysis requires special training and deep knowledge. And we should not mistake whim for reason. When we say something is against the dictates of reason, logic is a branch of mathematics. It requires study. That is not the same as saying, oh, well, gosh, that makes no sense to me. That is now using whim and pretending it's reason. We're talking about an actual logical contradiction in the hadith, an actual shudud or an actual illah in the matn. So while we have been very strongly pushing the use of reason, we now need to end the lecture by stressing that this is an analytical branch of hadith studies. It requires special training and deep knowledge, and we don't want to mistake our own whim for reason. But we also note that in the experience of the author, at least, many people are afraid to even bring up the issue of reason in hadith analysis, or to note that there should be matn analysis, due to intimidation by those who hold themselves as guardians of the Sunnah. And I already quoted for you from one Islamic's website railing against those who would use reason to look at a hadith, and we feel that this sort of intimidation should not be the case. Those who truly love the Prophet, peace be upon him, believe that he doesn't say things that are contrary to reason or to established facts. And so with that, we will end this 2-lecture topic, and inshallah, next lecture, we will move to yet another topic on how we should apply hadith. Assalamu alaikum.